Hi guys. I didn't like the fact that we didn't get to talk about beauty in class. I sort of made an executive decision and decided we really needed to focus on the paper itself and just sort of general structural things. I had you read beauty. We did not talk about it much at all. And I know that some of you will want to write about it. It's a really good poem. Obviously ties into most, if not all, in some way of the things we've talked about in class. So I felt like I'd do you a disservice if I didn't cover it at all. So I'm recording this sort of supplemental video. I won't do this a ton. I should also, producer's note real quick. That's a cat hitting the phone. There's gonna be cats. There might be screaming. This is Louis, he's a kitten. Yeah, okay. Anyway, I'll deal with that as it comes, but if you notice anything crazy, it's probably that. I have a 3-year-old napping. That'll be screaming if screaming occurs. All right, so let's get right into it. I'll keep this as quick as I can. Beauty. The thing that stands out, I would hope, just immediately after you read it, all the times he says you can't say it, right? Specifically if you're a man in the world he's from, the time and place he's from, the kind of man he's talking about, the kind of man we've talked about, in every class. You can't say it. And more to the point, it seems like at various times in the poem, you can't even think it, you can't acknowledge it, you can't appreciate it. You cannot appreciate beauty. And again, he gives all these examples early in that first stanza, or maybe first part of the poem. He numbers them for you. And that's all the times you can't say it. But one of the times, the reason I say acknowledge, like it goes further than just saying it. You can't acknowledge it. There in the last stanza, when he talks about the man and wife doing what, husbands and wives sometimes do, right? And he calls it beautiful. Like, these are two people that, hopefully love each other, and they're doing that whole thing. It should be like a beautiful thing. But the man in this moment cannot even think it, right? And the wife can't say it because it says she knows it would embarrass him, which is interesting. Cats. Anyway, so that's kind of going on throughout the poem. But what does any of that mean, right? Well, to begin with, taking it back to the first stanza, all the times he says you can't say it, he will occasionally give you exceptions to that. He says, no male member of my family has ever used this word in my hearing or anyone else's, except in reference perhaps to a new pickup or dead deer. That's one of the exceptions, right? And we understand too, when they say, when a guy says one of these things is beautiful or a beauty, you can almost hear them say it. They're not saying it in the same way, usually, right? Like if you see a beautiful truck, it's not the same as like a beautiful sunset or something like that, right? So they're using the same word but a different definition. And again, there's another great example of this, pretty much damn near middle of the poem, when Bobby Sudduth, that fun guy, who we'll talk about in a minute, talks about the shot that killed Kennedy, an assassin's bullet through the president's brain. And he says, that shot, what a beauty, right? He gets to use it there. But again, very different definition, right? Like he's talking about the skill of the sniper, Oswald, which again, yeah, by all accounts, hell of a shot. But that's a different definition. He's doing something else. So what else is going on? Well, in the first stanza, we have a man use the word or a synonym. He says lovely, right? He calls the centerpiece lovely. And the speaker's father has to get up and leave the room. The exercise I normally do, cats. I keep saying cat, it's kittens, so child cats. Anyway, sorry. Anyway, what I usually do in class when we talk about this poem, and I talk about this part with Uncle Ross, imagine in your head, don't say it out loud, but imagine in your head a word that if you heard it said, you would at least consider getting up and leaving the room, right? Whatever that word is, it's probably pretty terrible. How would you describe that word? It's offensive. It offends you, right? Lovely, beauty, because it's a synonym, offends the speaker's father, right? He can't be in the same room with a guy who would say it. So it has power, which again, I think the speaker points out in the first stanza, because it's the sort of thing, whether you say it or not, we kind of take for granted. You might hear it occasionally. Not in this world. Beauty cannot exist, cannot be acknowledged in the world that these men reside in. And to do that, you almost feel like it damages them in some way. It hurts them. And of course, the immediate question is, why? We'll table that for a second, but I want you thinking about that. Why does it damage them like this? Okay. Before we leave the first stanza behind, I also just want to briefly draw your attention to the epigraph. That is, you have the title, Beauty, and then immediately below that, therefore, their sons grow suicidally beautiful. That's the poem we looked at in class the very first day. Autumn Begins in Martins Ferry, Ohio. Very famous poem. It was very famous even when Beauty was written decades later. Normally, what you're doing with an epigraph, what we're doing here, he wants you thinking about that poem for some kind of a reason. And the easiest way I know to sum it up for you is, and again, in some way I would hope this is pretty clear, the world and the motivations, the anxieties, all the stuff we talked about that first day that are present in Martins Ferry, Ohio, is very, 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 very similar, very relevant to the world he's describing for you in Beauty. And it's, in a way, it's almost kind of a shortcut, right? Like, he gives you some description like throughout the poem that helps you figure that out anyway, but reading those two lines already, it's almost like a cheat, right? To put you in the right headspace. Okay, moving on. I said we'd leave the first stanza behind. There's one more thing I got to touch on, sorry. So we can't say beauty. And then right there at the end of the first stanza, he alludes to what they can say, what they can talk about. He gives you a couple examples before this, with like hemorrhoid operation and things like that. And I think it's meant to be a little bit funny, but these are topics that they can discuss. So he's trying to draw a line for you. And right at the end of the first stanza, I think he tries to sum it up. He's talking about being in the machine shop with his father. They both worked there. Sounds, again, it's one of those very, very blue collar jobs, very hard. And these men knew the true meaning of labor and money and other hard, true things, and did not ever use the word beauty. So again, we're drawing a line between whatever beauty is for these men in this world and labor, money, hard, true things. Hard and true things. Like, I talked to one of you already about this, and you came at me with the word tangible. I think that's part of it. I don't think that's all of it, but yeah, like something you can put your hands on, something you can manipulate with your hands. And I know, again, that sounds like a ridiculous definition, but again, if you consider what these men do all day, not just at work, although that's a lot of it, a lot of their life is work, manual labor, so with your hands. What do they do after work? Well, they might go get a beer, or if it's body and soul, they might go play baseball. When they get home, again, if we're thinking about body and soul, broken Kenmores, all that stuff, like so much of their day, I mean, percentage wise, 98% maybe, is that high enough? Maybe it needs to go a little higher. They're doing stuff with their hands. They are constantly interacting with the world through manual labor. So I think a big part of that definition is saying that that's not what beauty is, right? Beauty is somehow, and obviously there's associations of like femininity and things like, but softness beyond that. It's not just the feminine, even though it's definitely coded that way in the poem. It's softness in a way that I would actually describe as fragile, because he says hard, true things, like stable things. That's what true means accurate, but it also means upright. Like if you build something true, or if you true a site, you know, like it's accurate and it's stable, like it's sturdy. And so that's their whole life, is valuing those things. And anything that's not that is fragile in some way, perhaps like beauty, is at best unimportant. But okay. The second stanza, we'll take a hard shift. We're in late November. Bobby Sudduth, we get introduced to him. He's an interesting character. Really quick, and I know this seems, people get squeamish talking about him, which I think is good. I think you're supposed to. I don't think the speaker at all celebrates Bobby Sudduth, right, and his perspective. But when he says, he continues his sexual autobiography, the speaker says, and then quote, that's what the italics are, by the way. That's when someone is speaking. That's right, fucked my own sister, and I'll tell you, bud, it wasn't bad. And then after that, as far as I'm concerned, any man who hasn't had VD just isn't a man. VD is venereal disease. We call them STDs now, or they called it VD back then. Now, the most immediate question is, why would anyone do or think those things? Sure. But I think the better question is, because again, people are grossed out by this, you should be. My question is, why would you tell anyone, right? Like, whether or not these things are true, we have no way to verify it, and obviously the speaker's not going to ask, because the speaker doesn't want to know. He didn't want to know to begin with, but he doesn't want him to elaborate, right? I'm not interested in that information. Exactly. So why would a guy like Bobby Sudduth broadcast that information, want other people to know he thinks these things? And by the way, what is it he's telling people? Fuck my own sister, it wasn't that bad. Any man who hasn't had VD just isn't a man, stuff like that. What does he value here? Sex, like to the nth degree, right? We're talking about disease and incest. Like he wants it real bad. That's what he's saying, right? That's what he's trying to convince the speaker of. Why? Why would he care that much? Why would it be so important? Why would it be important enough for him that he would say those things to the speaker and hope that he believed him, right? Bobby Sudduth, in classes where I've taught this before, people want to label him as toxically masculine. He is. He absolutely is. But I also think when you just apply a label like that to anybody or anything, you're doing it a bit of a disservice. I mean, for instance, the speaker, I do think, tries to salvage Bobby a little bit at the end of the poem when he tells us what becomes of him, right? Shoots himself in the chest with a shotgun. Like, that guy had more going on, you know? You only hear really three things from him, because the beauty, like he says that shot was a beauty. You have two moments of like terrible guy, and then you find out years later he killed himself. So it seems like he's hurting too. Like he's trying to deal with something the best that he can, probably, because that's what anybody does. And maybe that's what it looks like for him, is saying these awful things, like trying to tell people that he's this kind of a guy. That's how he deals. And again, to me, when we talk about, because they wouldn't have had that language back then, like deal with something, I think the way that I would really describe it, to put it in a conversation with other poems we've looked at, he's surviving, right? So he's surviving by sort of putting on this toxically masculine persona. I mean, again, he may or may not honestly believe these things. We can't really prove that. But what we can prove is he broadcasts them. And that's his mode of survival. Again, we take it all the way back to Body and Soul when they talk about the idea of being a man in the eyes of their fathers and everyone else, right? Like, so much of masculinity in these poems seems to be how other people measure you. So for Bobby, my hypothesis would be not that he thinks these things or maybe even believes them, because maybe he does. We do not know. But what we do know is he wants the speaker to believe them about him. That's what's important. So this is about proving his masculinity Part of the title of the class is Masculinity as Performance. He's performing here, and it's disgusting, but I don't think he cares. Or even, again, you could argue, he wants the speaker to be disgusted. He wants the speaker to think, Jesus Christ, man, that guy is such an animal, right? Like, we have phrases like that on the one hand connote disgust, but on the other connote a weird kind of respect, or like, I can't believe that guy would go that far. That's not for me, you know, like, and he's elevated in a weird way, in a what the speaker would call toward the end of the poem, a perverse way. But it still operates like that, right? Like, Bobby in this poem, all on his own, the moments you hear from him, the weird sort of subculture of masculinity, I guess is what I would describe him as. Speaking of that, let's go to the third stanza. And I'm assuming you have this in front of you the whole time I'm talking to you. If you don't, are you taking notes in your head? What are you doing? Anyway, we're almost done. I see the clock. I'm going as fast as I can. It's a long poem. All right, third stanza. You get the eyes from California. By the way, we always mention California almost like it's a curse word, almost like it's like beauty as well. The only thing I could offer you there is, you know, Uncle Ross from California, these guys from California, more on them in a second. They look like Marlon Brando. They mention Hollywood, which is worse than California. Why? Why is it that way for these people, right? Well, what we know of this world, what we know of these guys, hard, true things, Hollywood is make-believe. It's acting, it's movies, it's all fake. It's supposed to be. But also, and again, we have these stereotypes now that operate on us, I think, in a similar way. People view the South a certain kind of way. People view California a certain kind of way. Much more liberal, not just politically. That term has been kind of co-opted for politics. All liberal really means is free. But California is like much freer, you know, in all kinds of ways. That freedom that I think a lot of us would consider to be a good thing, for these guys is, again, like toxic in some way. It's bad in some way, potentially dangerous. I don't know. And part of how you can speak to that in this poem is at the very beginning of the third stanza, when the speaker tells us these guys look like Marlon Brando and mention Hollywood. Those are two of the three things we know about them. He also mentions their car, right? It's important to him, this detail. He takes note of it and then tells us. So it matters to these people. But what matters even more is what these guys do. I sometimes have students confused about this. That's why I wanted to touch on it really quick. They are, according to the speaker, he finds out later because he didn't know the word at the time, he tells us, exhibitionists. What is an exhibitionist? It's pretty much exactly what these guys do. They want to, I mean, some people take it to different levels, but all these guys do, again, because some people get confused here, they want to get naked in places they should not be naked. That's it. That's what they're into. Some people, some students have come to me before. I'm like, are these guys gay? I'm like, there's nothing, they could be, but not in the poem. Like, there's no sexy stuff anywhere. Like, they just want to be naked in a place they shouldn't be. It'd be like if these two guys were walking around today, they might walk into Kroger and strip, you know? And they'd get probably a similar kind of reaction that they get in the poem. And some of you out there are like, people do that? Oh yeah, people do all kinds of stuff. But in the poem, nobody from the speaker's world does this, right? This gets lumped in with California. Remember the definition I gave you of liberal, freedom. Ultimate freedom would be, you know what? I'm gonna take off my clothes right now. Like that's kind of what that looks like. So yeah. But to take it to the poem itself, we get a couple interesting lines I want you to take note of. We're on the page, if you're looking at the copy on Courseden, we're in the third stanza, but we're on the page where the fourth stanza starts, right at the bottom to help you. We're right about here. Okay. Anyway, there's a line in there This is the speaker. I recall how fragile and pale their bodies seemed against the iron and steel of the drill presses. When he's talking about their bodies, he's talking about the two naked guys. There's that word again, fragile. Now, again, I think we could pretty easily understand, on the surface, he's saying these are two naked human bodies surrounded by a machine shop and all the cutting tools and drilling and all this stuff, these hard, true things, right? But they're made of iron and steel, and they're not fragile. And there are these two guys naked right in the middle of it that when they take off their clothes, you can appreciate, I think he's implying, the fragility of the human body. Even if it's a man, it doesn't matter. We're all fragile. We can get broken pretty easily. And he appreciates it because it's surrounded by all these things that aren't. Well, how does the room react to that, right? Most of the guys don't know what to do, right? I mean, by the way, the speaker alludes to the appropriate place, and then he gives you a couple appropriate places for men to be naked. I'm trying to find it real quick. It's not a locker room. They're not taking a shower, right? Like, there's certain places men are allowed to look like this. This ain't it. He says they're beautiful. Again, that would be part of proving my argument that beauty is, part of its definition is fragility. It's right here. Like, they are beautiful because they are fragile, because they are breakable. But anyway, where was I? Sorry. Okay, so most of the guys are standing there. They don't know what to do, right? Bobby knows what to do. He runs at them with an iron file. The speaker says there's a terror on his face, an animal wildness. So, like, not even human in this moment. He's almost out of his mind in some way, his rational mind, which is interesting, especially given what we already know about this guy, right? But he's gonna go kill them. An iron file, like, I come from a very blue-collar background, in case you don't. An iron file is like at least this long. It's an iron bar. It's meant to file stuff down like you would your nails, but it's made of iron. There's big spikes on it. Yeah, he's not coming to say hi. Like, this is about to be a tragedy. And the speaker's father puts a stop to it, right? He's the responsible one in the room. But again, here, I mean, what's the interesting difference between what Bobby said before and what Bobby does now, you could argue, I think pretty easily, that Bobby is broadcasting information that he wants people to know there in the second stanza, right? Here at the end of the third, the speaker describes it as like something taking over, right? That animal wildness. He's not thinking about doing, he just does this. So the other way I would think about that is, again, you could easily argue he is sort of trying to live up to a narrative, if you like, in the second stanza with his sexual autobiography. Kittens. But in the third stanza, you could argue maybe the narrative takes over, right? Like, now, like, he was maybe a little bit in charge in the second, but now I don't. This isn't him like deciding, right? Like, what he is supposed to do in this moment takes over and tells him to do this. I think with the way the speaker describes it. Okay. So anyway, obviously those guys leave, and we're left. Oh, sorry, I gotta move. We're left with the last stanza. And I love the very first, they're very easy to miss because they're the first lines of the last stanza of a long poem. But the speaker says, "So there they are, as I will always remember them." He's talking about the guys in the machine shop. The men who were once fullbacks or tackles or guards, in their three-point stances knuckling into the mud, hungry for high school glory and the pride of their fathers, eager to gallop terribly against each other's bodies. Now, of course, there's the Martin's Ferry again, and we talked about that line specifically, gallop terribly against each other's bodies, the line before, for the pride of their fathers, right? Like, they were once those kids in Martin's Ferry, right? Doing this for their community. And of course, we get to see them now. They've graduated to their adult lives where they work in these factories until they die, basically. But importantly, because I think some of you will miss this because maybe you're not into sports, I know I don't look like I'm into anything, but I'm pretty big into football. Fullbacks, tackles, guards. Now, outside of some exceptions, and there's reasons for that we don't need to get into, but especially in high school football, those are the positions nobody really talks about. Like, even if you're not into football, you've probably heard of a guy like Tom Brady. Maybe you've heard of Aaron Rodgers. Maybe you've heard of Julio Jones, who just left town, so that's fun. They're quarterbacks and a wide receiver. Like, those are skill positions. Those are the people that catch the ball, throw the ball, score the points. They get all the accolades, and in a lot of cases, all the money. Fullbacks, tackles, guards, they block. They do the dirty work. Kind of what these guys are doing now, right? They don't get any accolades. They don't get any shine. So yeah, their whole lives have been like this. Even the speaker is kind of telling us when they were playing for the community, for the pride of their fathers, you know, they were never the headliner, basically. It was a bit of a bummer, but we're almost done. If you weren't sold on my idea earlier that a lot of this has to do with bodies and fragility, so much, damn near all of the rest of this stanza is about bodies. We keep talking about bodies, seeing the father in the bath. My wife is on the phone now. Great. Seeing the father and feeling diminished by his body as a boy, and he's an adult, right? But then hitting someone after class in the face and feeling the abundance of their bodies, right? Like they're growing into what is going to be this man's body. Like, so much of this is wrapped up in physical capability and appearance, right? But we, here in like 10 or 15 of these lines, he kind of takes us through the growth of that, what that looks like into adolescence. We talk about the man and wife doing what husband and wife sometimes do. And again, there's that moment where he can't say beautiful, which implies that he might think it is. You would hope he does. And she can't say it because it would embarrass him. And here, this to me, this is one of the hard questions I always ask about body and soul. There's that line about what did it cost them. I think this is what it cost them. Moments like this, he can't acknowledge it and she can't either. No one in this situation is allowed to say that this is beautiful, even though it is. And isn't that kind of what that, I'm trying to think of a way to describe it, that's what makes it so great. Two people that love each other and do that sort of thing, right? This is a beautiful thing to be involved in, and they're not allowed to have it. That's the cost. So when they're not allowed to say beauty, I think it's also they're not allowed to experience it, basically ever. And it's sort of this what's associated with beauty. They're also not allowed to have, not allowed to know, and it's always kept from them. And that is how, again, to take it back to body and soul, they sort of maintain their masculinity. And I want to say one of the thesis statements we came up with in that class sort of alludes to this concept, but it's a mode of survival, but it's also stifling. Like, you can live this way, but if and when you do, you can only live this way, because to step outside, like to step out of bounds, you give it all up. Like it's an all or nothing proposition. But anyway, to kind of end it, we get Bobby there, the end of him, and we come back to the sort of frame of the narrative, which is, and we didn't talk about this before, but the speaker's in Italy. He's in the Bargello. I don't speak Italian. Bargello. I think it's Bargello. I don't know. In Florence, Italy. It's a famous museum, and he's looking at art, which is a beautiful things, right? He is far away from where he grew up, I think literally and figuratively, and he's allowed to appreciate this stuff, right? He's a poet, for God's sake. He's talking to his wife. She asks again what he's thinking, because that's how we started. He's going to tell her about a strange afternoon in Kansas. He's going to tell her the story about those guys in the machine shop with the taking off the clothes. He's going to tell her that story now. Then he ends, obviously, the poem with the word beauty. He can say it. He can acknowledge it. And to me, like, I don't want anyone to misunderstand. I don't think he's ever trying to say that the men, the world he left behind, like, somehow are beneath him or not as good. It's nothing to do with that. Merely that from his vantage point now, years later, and again, in a time and place where he's allowed to say it and acknowledge it and appreciate beauty, he understands, I think, so much of what those guys were missing. And there's different ways to put it. I mean, you may even potentially be able to argue that what these guys were giving up, maybe it's a sacrifice. I don't know that it's entirely conscious. I don't know that you could prove that, but sacrifice is a sacrifice, whether it's conscious or not. But I think you may be able to argue that they're, for the sake of whatever they thought might have been important, whether it was their families or their home lives, right? We get some of that. So much depends upon their manual labor, their physical ability. Maybe they can't cattail. Maybe they can't appreciate beauty, right? And do the kind of work they have to do, not just at work, but in their lives. Maybe they pay the cost for the rest of us, you know. These are, I'm spinning into hypothesis world here, but these kinds of thoughts, I wanted to give you some right at the end of this to hopefully help you guys think more about the poem. I think all of the poems we've read from Fairchild are meant to celebrate the time and place he grew up in, the men he grew up around, specifically because I think he doesn't think, and I think we would all agree with him, I think he thinks these guys don't get celebrated. They're fullbacks and tackles and guards, right? Nobody talks about them. They just kind of work until they die, and that's sort of it. But they are integral in a lot of ways. Some that are easy to understand, you know, because you need people to work jobs like that. But again, I'll end the video with this idea that I think it's easy to see their work extends beyond the like 9 to 5 or whatever job they do. It's and I think Fairchild and or the speaker wants us to know more about that. And I think he laments the fact that they're not able to say beauty or acknowledge it, you know. But I would never go so far as to say he thinks that they're somehow lesser for that. Quite the opposite, in fact. Especially because, again, with the Martins Ferry illusions, those are people that aren't allowed so much. And James Wright, the author of that poem, wants to celebrate them for it, right? That they kind of give up so much of their lives to do these things that they do, to live the way that they do. And I think you could apply that here as well. All right. As always, anything you guys want to send me, I've heard from some of you with emails and drafts and things like this. You can hit me up. I got no problem with that. But again, hopefully this will help you, especially if you're thinking about writing about beauty. Although I would also say Beauty is the first poem in Art of the Lathe, which is the book all these poems come from. And it's in some ways, I think, a bit of a keystone to the world that all these poems are in. You know, I think it can help you understand any of these poems, no matter which one you decide to write about. So hope it helps, and I'll see you guys Monday. Thanks.